Anybody here think we ought to audit the Fed? Well, we're one step closer. Almost every Republican and over or close to 100 Democrats voted for it, and it passed overwhelmingly in the House today. So we're excited about that. Now, we haven't been too excited about what they did with Obamacare, and I was very disappointed when that came out. For weeks we'd been talking about it, months been talking about it, and we really were encouraged. We thought we might win. And I think it's a little bit of a victory that we actually had the discussion in the first place, because for the first time in about 70 years, we were actually discussing whether or not a bill was constitutional, whether or not the Constitution had actually given this power to Congress. This was actually being discussed. So it was a big step forward. But we were disappointed with the ruling. When the ruling came down, my first response was, just because a couple of guys on the Supreme Court say it's constitutional doesn't make it so. So my wife wasn't really clapping. She says, why don't you count to 10 before you say anything, all right? And then the liberal bloggers and the liberal, Huffington Post and various other posts said, well, what is he questioning Marbury versus Madison? Is he questioning judicial review? And I was like, no, I was just kind of ticked off, really. But I was unhappy, but I also was trying to say, and what I was really trying to say, what I'm still saying is I have counted to 10, and I still think it's unconstitutional. I agree with Justice Thomas. I agree with, Justice Scalia and others that it's unconstitutional. I agree with Madison. Basically, this fight's been going on since the beginning of the Republic, and this fight will go on and on and on. The fight is over whether or not we have a government that is limited by the Constitution or whether we have unlimited government. George Will got it right. George Will said the case against Obamacare is the last exit on the highway to unlimited government. Because basically, if we don't have any limitations, we wind up with everything a majority wants. And a majority can vote and vote and vote until we finally run out of money, and that's sort of where we're approaching at this point. But the thing is about it is that this debate goes on. It doesn't end. The Supreme Court has made bad decisions before. This debate started with Hamilton and Madison, but Madison said that even if this were a tax, which, they call it a penalty 18 times in the bill, then the Supreme Court decrees that it's a tax. But even if it were a tax, Hamilton said that the tax and spending authority, which is given to Congress, says it should be for the general welfare. And when he was questioned, and he said, well, does the general welfare, does that just mean for anything that's good that the majority want? He said, no. Why would we have listed 19 specific powers, 19 enumerated powers that were specifically given to Congress if we really meant that the power to tax was to be unlimited? So we went back and we looked at a few cases. And one of the cases we looked at was from 1936, and this is U.S. versus Butler. And it's an interesting case. It's not a perfect case to support our case, but it's pretty interesting. The court strikes down a tax. They say that this tax is coercive, it's regulatory in nature, and it exceeds the authority of the federal government. This is something that's in the purview of the state government. And they strike it down. But what I found particularly ironic is the justice who writes the opinion is Justice Roberts. A different Justice Roberts, but so we wrote an editorial on this, and I concluded by saying, the more I hear about the first Justice Roberts, the more I like him better than the second Justice Roberts. Unfortunately, that decision goes on to say in its reasoning, even though it strikes down a tax as unconstitutional, it says in its reasoning that, well, really the taxing authority, we did strike this bill down, but the taxing authority really should not be limited by the enumerated powers. So it's not a perfect case. They strike down a bill, but then they say, well, the taxing authority, you can do whatever you want. And that's a problem. And that's kind of where we are now. So some conservatives and limited government people have said, well, at least they narrowed the Commerce Clause. They said you can't do anything through the Commerce Clause. Well, yeah, but they said you can now do anything through the tax clause. So it's not much, it's hard to look for a victory here. The only victory maybe we can find is that it spurs people to go out and vote, because the Supreme Court's not going to overturn Obamacare, but now the electorate still has one chance at the ballot box. I think if we don't do it at the ballot box in November, it doesn't get done, because I think it will so solidify, become so entrenched that it's hard to get rid of it. And programs in government essentially become eternal after a while. Reagan said one time that there were very few programs that had ever gotten rid of, and he said one of them was, we no longer bred horses for the cavalry, we no longer distilled rum for the soldiers, and he said that once upon a time there was a guy, he gave this as an example of how hard it is to get rid of government programs. He says once upon a time England put a guy on the cliffs of Dover and they said, ring a bell when you see Napoleon coming. Well, you know when they got rid of his position? In 1946. So it's very difficult to get rid of a government job once it's created. And for those of you who say, well, that, I know not in this crowd, but let's say in some other crowds, the Constitution's not that big a deal, that's just constitutional niceties, we just need health care. Well, here's a question you have to ask. If you just say, the majority has spoken, we just need health care for everybody. Here's a question you have to ask. Medicare is a big government insurance program. It insures about 50, 60 million people. It's $35 to $40 trillion short. 35 to $40 trillion short. You're going to pay for it, but there's not enough of you to pay for it. That's part of the problem. There's a bunch of old people and not